What if Alexander the Great had not died from illness on June 13, 323 BC in Babylon? Surely he would have embarked on new conquests, including to the west. How then would world history have unfolded? This question is not only posed by contemporary fans of alternative history. Even in ancient times, this topic was used for rhetorical school exercises, and the great Roman historian, Titus Livy, dedicated several pages of his works to it. Unlike the Roman patriot Livy, who predicted a certain defeat for the great Macedonian by the proud sons of Romulus, modern historians tend to give the edge to Alexander. Let's try to imagine which way the scales would have tipped. Anticipating Pyrrhus, if Alexander had contemplated a western campaign to conquer Italy, Sicily, and Carthage in North Africa, how would he have acted, where would he have begun? Fortunately, we have a clue in the form of a story narrated by Plutarch in the biography of Pyrrhus. It refers to the famous conversation between the king and his friend Cineas, who tried to dissuade Pyrrhus from his planned venture. They say, began Cineas, that the Romans are a valiant people and, moreover, they have many warlike tribes under their control. If the gods grant us victory over them, what will it bring us? Pyrrhus replied, You, Cineas, are asking about things that are self-evident. If we defeat the Romans, no barbarian or Greek city in Italy will be able to resist us, and we'll quickly take over the entire country. And who better than you knows how vast, rich, and powerful it is? After a short pause, Cineas continued, And what will we do, king, once we possess Italy? Pyrrhus responded, Sicily, a flourishing and populous island, lies very close. It reaches out to us, and capturing it would be effortless, especially now, after the death of Agathocles, with everything there in revolt and the cities in chaos due to mob leaders. Well, that's fair, continued Cineas. So, having taken Sicily, will we end our campaign? But Pyrrhus countered, If the gods send us success and victory, it will be just a prelude to great deeds. How can we not proceed to Africa, to Carthage, when it's just a stone's throw away from there? And if we possess them, no enemy currently afflicting us would be able to resist us, isn't that so? It's uncertain whether this dialogue between the king and his confidant actually took place or if it was crafted by some Epicurean philosopher, urging the world's mighty to be content with the happiness of the present day. What's important is that, in broad terms, it mirrors the main milestones of Pyrrhus's Italian campaign from 280 to 275 BC. As is known, he was invited to Italy by the Tarentines, who feared Rome's growing power. In 280 BC, with an army of 25,000, the king inflicted a heavy defeat on the Romans at Heraclea, and in the following year, at Asculum. Both victories cost Pyrrhus significant losses, prompting him to try to negotiate a peace on favorable terms. In 278 BC, the general ventured from Italy to Sicily, defeated the Carthaginians there, gained control over almost the entire island, and began extensive preparations for a campaign in Africa. However, in the midst of it, he found himself forced to return to Italy, where the Romans resumed their offensive. Most likely, had Alexander acted 40 years earlier, he would have done the same. After the death of Alexander of Epirus in 331 BC, conflicts flared up across southern Italy, leading to a war of all against all. Alexander would likely not have had to wait long for a pretext to intervene in such a volatile atmosphere. With the backing of the Greek population in Italy, access to ports convenient for landing, and virtually inexhaustible human and financial resources, Alexander could have undertaken military operations on the grandest scale, without any constraints. He would have had the strongest army of that era under the command of the best general of all time. All his military leaders, as well as many officers and soldiers, had the experience of the Persian campaign behind them. The wealthy agricultural regions of the southern peninsula would have served as his supply base. If necessary, food and other resources could be transported by sea. Comparing Alexander to Pyrrhus, Livy wrote that a single defeat would have been enough to shatter all of Alexander's ambitions. However, it's more likely that his opponent simply wouldn't have gotten such an opportunity. Choosing an adversary. A significant distinction would be that Alexander's adversary in Italy would not have been Rome, but rather the Lucanians, Iapyges, Messapians, and other tribes of Apulia, which, by the end of the 4th century BC, were threatening the Greek coastal cities. The Messapians, Iapyges, Pusetians, and Dornians were descendants of the Illyrians who migrated to Italy from the Balkan Peninsula at the end of the 2nd millennium BC. The Lucanians were the southern branch of the Oscan, Umbrian linguistic group, related to the Sabines and Samnites who lived in the central part of Italy. They arrived here in the 6th to 5th centuries BC and became a restless and dangerous neighbor to the Greek cities like Tarentum, Thurii, Metapontum, Heraclea, and others. To counter them, the Greeks invited the Spartan king Archidamus III in 343 to 338 BC. After his death in 334 BC, they sought assistance from King Alexander of Epirus, 345 to 331 BC. The latter was the brother of Olympias and thus was Alexander the Great's maternal uncle. The relatives eyed each other's successes with jealousy. Upon hearing about his uncle's victories over the Messapians and Lucanians, Alexander, fresh from his defeat of Darius III at Issus, dismissively referred to them as mouse games. The Epirote king retorted that, supposedly, he had to fight against real men here, while Alexander was fighting against women in Persia. It's uncertain how this might have culminated if Alexander of Epirus hadn't fallen into a Lucanian ambush near Pandosia, and perished in 331 BC. For a long time, the Greeks were unaware of Rome and its military achievements. Only the victories over the Samnites during the wars of 326 to 304 BC, and 298 to 290 BC made the Romans known in southern Italy and beyond. In 291 BC, they established the colony of Venusia, situated on the border of Samnium, Lucania, and Apulia. Shortly after this, the Greek city of Thurii appealed to Rome for protection against the Lucanian raids. The Romans tried to address this matter first through diplomacy and then militarily. In 282 BC, the consul Gaius Fabricius Luscinus defeated the Lucanians in a major battle and subsequently placed Roman garrisons in Heraclea, Locri, and Rhegium. His actions aroused the apprehensions of Tarentum, which turned to Pyrrhus for assistance in 280 BC. Thus, the geopolitical reality Pyrrhus confronted upon landing in Italy 40 years later did not yet exist. Moreover, between 326 and 304 BC, Rome was embroiled in a war against the Samnites, who at that time were the closest relatives and allies of the Lucanians. Paradoxically, in the enemy of my enemy paradigm, had Alexander arrived in Italy during this period, Rome would have had a greater chance of becoming his ally rather than his adversary. Notably, the first attempt to initiate talks with the Romans is attributed by historians to Alexander of Epirus. However, his untimely death nullified his accomplishments. Roman potential. Given that the subject of our study is entirely speculative, let's set aside the geopolitical reality and consider the military capabilities of Rome between the mid-4th century BC and Pyrrhus' arrival in Italy in 280 BC. As a result of continuous wars and territorial conquests, the Roman domain expanded from 1,300 km² at the beginning of the 5th century BC to 10,000 km² by the mid-4th century BC. The core of these territories was the land surrounding the city, covering an area of 2,700 km², Ager Romanus. The Romans also held nearly half of the agricultural lands of Latium, Latium Vetus, a significant portion of lands in southern Etruria, Ager Veentinus, as well as territories in Campania, Samnium, and Picenum settled by Roman colonists. A substantial population resided in these lands. The number of citizens in Rome itself around 338 BC is estimated at 30,000. Another 120,000 lived in the city's agricultural district, and 195,000 in the more distant regions of Roman holdings. Thus, the total citizenry amounted to 345,000. In addition to their own service-eligible citizens, the Romans could also rely on 135,000 allies, contractual obliged to send auxiliary troops to the Roman army. With the annexation of new lands and the expansion of rights, by 304 BC, the Roman civilian population had grown by roughly 20%, from 345,000 to 405,000, while the number of allies increased almost fourfold, from 135,000 to 520,000. By 304 BC, the total mobilization potential Rome had at its disposal reached 925,000 individuals. Of course, the total civilian population does not equate to the number of armies that took to the battlefield. According to modern estimates, 35% of the male population in a traditional society is too young for military service, 0 to 14 years, and about 13% are too old for it, 50 years. Excluding these portions, we see that only 52% of the census-passed citizens are fit for active military service. This percentage isn't final either, as between a third to half of the remainder were proletarians, the poorest citizens of the sixth property class. They were conscripted into the army only in times of utmost danger and typically served as lightly armed troops, soldier servants, or rowers on warships. Thus, out of the total of 405,000 citizens registered in 304 BC, only 100,000–150,000 were actually eligible for conscription. Since in the 4th century BC, Romans increasingly avoided full mobilization, under normal circumstances they aimed to draft unmarried young men aged 17 to 25, who made up at least 2/3 of a legion's soldiers. The remaining third comprised warriors aged 25 to 30 and veterans from older age groups. Therefore, demographically speaking, the Roman military system largely relied on the conscription of young men from property classes IV. Typically, during the wars of the latter half of the 4th century BC, the Romans annually recruited initially 2, and then 4 legions from their citizenry, which were accompanied by roughly equal-sized contingents of allies. At the Battle of Heraclea against Pyrrhus in 280 BC, the Roman army comprised 4 legions with a total of 16,000 to 20,000 soldiers and around 16,000 allies. Comparable in size were the Roman forces that fought in 279 BC at Asculum and in 275 BC at Beneventum. In extraordinary circumstances, the Romans could muster armies twice that size, consisting of 8 legions of citizens and a similar number of allies, such as during the Gallic invasion in 225 BC or for the Battle of Cannae against Hannibal in 216 BC. The Second Punic War showcased Rome's impressive mobilization capabilities, as at the height of the conflict in 212 BC, they had deployed 25 legions across various fronts. These forces consisted of roughly 35% of the adult male citizens aged between 17 and 45. For Hannibal to break this military might, one Cannae-like defeat wasn't enough. It would have taken 2 or 3 more such losses for Rome to finally plead for mercy. Projecting these peak numbers to 304 BC, with a comparable level of mobilization, we'd see an army of 10 Roman legions comprising approximately 45,000 soldiers, and an equal-sized contingent of allies. Interestingly, Livy arrives at similar numbers when assessing the strengths of the opposing sides and weighing their chances of victory. He estimates Alexander's army to include 30,000 Macedonian veterans and 4,000 cavalry. Adding to them Persians, Indians, and other nations, Livy writes, he would have brought more of an encumbrance than aid. A distinct advantage for the Romans would have been their short supply lines. Consider that the Romans had reinforcements close at hand, while Alexander, waging war on foreign soil, would have seen his forces gradually diminish, as later happened with Hannibal. A single defeat would have been enough for Alexander to lose the entire war. But what kind of battle could break the Romans, who weren't shattered by either Cordium or Cannae? In his extensive analysis of the strengths of the opposing sides, Livy predominantly relies on rhetorical arguments. On the one hand, he underestimates Alexander's mobilization capabilities, which appear boundless. It's enough to recall that during the Wars of the Diadochi, at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, The combined forces of both sides on the battlefield comprised 85,000 heavy infantry, 45,000 light infantry, 25,000 cavalry, 550 elephants, and 100 chariots. On the other hand, Livy overestimates the Romans' ability to withstand continuous blows from a potent enemy. Having lost between 7,000 to 15,000 of their soldiers in the battle against Pyrrhus at Heraclea, and then another 6,000 the following year at Asculum, Rome, thanks to its reserves, could relatively easily restore its army's previous strength and achieve victory at Beneventum. But what would have transpired had the victory that day gone to Pyrrhus? Could the Romans have rebounded from another catastrophic defeat? After all, Alexander was a commander whose military prowess was acknowledged by the greatest generals, Pyrrhus, Hannibal, and others. How long would it have taken Alexander to inflict upon the Romans losses they would deem intolerable? It seems the outcome of such a struggle is predictable. However, that would have been an entirely different story.